House of the Dragon, Episode 3, and it is so much more comfortable to be doing these on the second channel, where we can just be more casual, we can be relaxed, we can talk. I don't have to be so precise as I am on the main channel. It is nice here. And if you are a new viewer, welcome to my imagination kingdom. What did you think of the episode? Let me know down below. Episode 3 jumps a few years into the future to the birthday of Aegon. Yep, Alicent Hightower and Viserys' first son. My girlfriend was kind of like, what, did that just happen? But yes, it happened. And it's also technically the firstborn son of the king. Now, there are kind of three storylines in this episode, right? There's the royal hunt, there's Rhaenyra's bitterness, and Daemon's war down in the Stepstones against the crab feeder. But first I want to talk about time jumps, because episode 3 is really the first episode where you really feel it, and they're important. See, House of the Dragon is really about this Targaryen civil war called the Dance of Dragons, but they couldn't really just start with that, right? Like, they needed this historical context to set up what was to come over decades. And for people who don't really know what's coming, there might be a constant sense of not quite really knowing where the story is going for a while. Like, who are the main villains? Who are the heroes? What is the main conflict? Like, you might have very reasonably thought that the crab feeder was gonna be a bigger part of the series, but nope. Or Daemon's war down in the Stepstones, but nope. Or maybe it was the slow, horrible decline of Rhaenyra's and Alicent's relationship. But no, that just happens. I don't want you to feel like we don't know the story at all. We have met some of the major players. We've got Rhaenyra, we've got Alicent, we've got Otto, we've got Daemon, right? But there are quite a number to come. And a huge part of this story is that the characters and relationships and alliances change so much over the course of the events, over these years. And that really only has a lot of meaning if we can see how this was all the years before, through childhood, through generations, right? It's to set up those changes. So much of the horror of the Dance of Dragons comes from how it's a generational war. So they really did need all of this setup, and I'm really glad that they're taking the time to do it. But I will admit, that does mean that some people have a little bit of a skewed idea of what the story is going to be about in the future, and that's okay. That is just exciting, I promise you. If you don't know, and if you do, right? The problem with time skips is that you've got to simultaneously demonstrate that things have happened, and you've got to explain what those things are, even when you might have skipped them because they're not that interesting. And sometimes people feel robbed if they don't get to see what they wanted to see, but I think that House of the Dragon has so far handled them really well with kind of these big bullet point plot beats, right? Like a marriage, a child, a war down in the Stepstones, the breakdown of this relationship, all that. But it still does have a long way to go, and I think we're about to have some of the actors change, which is going to be difficult because I think that the actresses for Alicent and Rhaenyra have been just played brilliantly so far. You know, normally I'd want to talk about all the changes between the show and the book, but to be perfectly honest, virtually everything in episode 3 is made up totally from scratch. Like, all we get in the book is that King's Landing was an endless round of feasts, balls, and tourneys where mummers and singers heralded the birth of each new Targaryen princeling. And that does bring us to the royal hunt. And I want to talk about symbolism in Martin's writing for a sec. So this hunting party is taking place on Aegon's birthday, and the Lannisters and Hightowers seem determined to find this regal white stag so that Viserys can kill it, and they can be like, hey, a white stag, that's a sign from the gods that Aegon should be king, not Rhaenyra, right? Even though they don't find this white stag, they do find a brown one, and I found it quite funny that they still insist, like, oh, it's a regal enough sign from the gods. See, Martin's work features a lot of dreams and visions, but it's often less about what those dreams and visions say and how people use them, how people interpret them, how they fit in with people's different biases and desires. Like, Remember that comet at the end of season 2 that everyone saw up in the sky and everyone took to validate whatever they were trying to say? It's like that. The more interesting part is how people manufacture meaning and use prophecy for their own ends and biases. Where a lot of fantasy is concerned with the divine or destiny or fate, Martin is a lot more concerned with the human side of these things, right? And we see that very explicitly in this episode. Again, Martin has always been kind of a character first, spectacle second kind of writer. His stories don't often feature the spectacle front and center, to the point that even some of those big plot beats, like battles, happen off screen. Now, I gotta be honest, the scene where Viserys has to kill the stag is probably the most uncomfortable scene in House of the Dragon so far for me. I don't deal with animal pain very well, but I want to talk about it because there's some really interesting symbolism. Like Viserys tries to stab this huge stag to kill it, right? But he doesn't manage it the first time. And he has to be persuaded to hit it again, to deliver the killing blow. He's really reluctant to do that. This half-hearted attempt to kill it just makes its suffering worse. And I mean, this is Viserys. When he acts, he often makes things worse. And when he does, it's often with only a half measure. The realm is conspiring around him to replace his daughter as heir, and he only half-heartedly puts his foot down. Like, his unwillingness to be firm only makes the suffering for everyone around him worse. And there's this really interesting dynamic where he is surrounded by people of bold action, Otto, Rhaenyra, Daemon, Corlys, and he is seemingly the only thing stopping them from all taking bold action at once. What happens when he's gone? Speaking of which, I just want to praise Paddy Considine's performance here. This episode probably has my favourite scene I've seen in the series so far, when Viserys is standing in front of the bonfire, he's wasted as hell, and he's just in absolute grief, tearing himself apart about what he's lost. Beautifully acted. It was just, it really did touch me. You really feel for him and this character. And it reminds us that these stories are always at their best in their quietest, most intimate moments, right? In the opening chapter of Game of Thrones, by the way, in talks of symbolism, the Starks find a direwolf who has died choking on an antler, the symbols of the Baratheons and Starks. And this kind of represents their mutual demise to come. And the fact that the white stag we talked about before, the one they were trying to find for Aegon, actually appears to Rhaenyra does kind of mark her out as a one true king figure, which does fit in with the more high fantasy edge that House of the Dragon seems to have compared to Game of Thrones. Like, when I say more high fantasy, I mean that the world is, in a quite literal way, like more magical at this time. There's more sorcerers and magic swords and dragons. There's the sense that there are more legendary heroes who can do more legendary feats, and we kind of see that in Daemon in the episode. There is this real sense that the Targaryens have something magical to them that comes from their incestuous blood dragon stuff. Thread throughout this episode is Rhaenyra's bitterness, right? Like, her best friend just married her dad, she hid that from him, her dad didn't really talk to her about it, she feels like she's being replaced. It's all totally understandable. And I find focusing on this bitterness really interesting because I know what's coming. Like, she is in a way a typical spiteful, frustrating teenager. He says, if I told her she couldn't marry a Lannister, she'd want to marry a Lannister in the episode. But we also do see some real anger and violence in her, when she's stabbing this boar in the episode. She gets attacked by a boar and she just like goes at it like, ugh. It's pretty dark, harrowing moment in a way. But you see, The Dance of Dragons is not a story about good versus evil. It's not. And this episode does present her as the main character, but it's also legitimately trying to show why people might not want her on the throne, or why people might just want someone else on the throne, why there might be legitimate other ways of viewing the situation. Like, Alicent reaches out to her over and over. She tries to be kind. She tries to insist the throne is Rhaenyra's, but Rhaenyra has none of it. Kind of treats her like trash anyway. Putting in the work to make Alicent likable is really important. Viserys is also trying to kind of marry Rhaenyra off, and you can understand why that would make someone bitter as well. It plays out a little bit differently in the books, but not different enough to really remark on it. Though there is one line that apparently Viserys does consider marrying her to the Prince of Dawn, which is something that will happen to bring Dawn into the Seven Kingdoms about 70 years later down the Targaryen line. There is one interesting difference though, who suggests that she marry Prince Aegon, the new kid, and her half-brother. Remember, incest is no stranger to the Targaryen family. So in the books, we're told that Queen Alicent suggested it, that she wanted her elder son, Prince Aegon, and Rhaenyra's half-brother. But in the show, it's Otto Hightower who suggests it. See, I find this interesting because Otto's manipulations have been attributed to Alicent in the books a few times now. And I think that's because the historians have kind of imagined her with more agency than she has, when in reality she's kind of this pretty young girl who's been hemmed into this role by family and duty and tradition, and she didn't really get much of a say. But, you know, the people writing the history books probably don't really respect or understand that very much. And one of the things that this world has always done really well is often respect, you know, the ways in which gender play into societal structures. Alicent in the episode still calls Viserys Your Grace in private, even though she's been married to him for years. And he's a guy who isn't that torn up about, you know, like, titles and whatever. She clearly feels uncomfortable and a little awkward around him, and I like the subtle ways they're exploring that. It's this really awkward dynamic, but she's trying her best. Fundamentally though, we're seeing these divisions begin to appear, cracks appearing in House Targaryen, you know, between the Velaryons and the Targaryens, between Alicent's line and Rhaenyra's line. And these are one day going to boil over, you might imagine. What's interesting is that, you know, the reluctance to bind families together through marriage, through politics, through alliances, is a recurring thing, right? It happened when Viserys didn't want to marry Laena Velaryon, and he dismisses the idea of Rhaenyra marrying Aegon. And this is all in spite of the fact that he insists that not even he is above duty and tradition. He says this, but he seems incapable of living up to it. All of this is set against the backdrop of Daemon's war down at the Stepstones, a region of craggy, useless islands, right? Corlys is fighting down here for money, for trade, because that's how his family got rich. But Daemon is here for blood and glory, to find something he never could in King's Landing. Now, Fire and Blood paints this war with the Crab Feeder as a relatively easy win, whereas the show kind of ramps up the tension. It makes it seem like they're losing. And you might go, oh, well, this is just to create more tension, but this is actually the exact sort of inaccuracy you'd imagine in a fake history book, right? Like, they imagine their own victories as greater, their own losses as smaller, wants to paint themselves as heroes. I think it is hilarious that Daemon immediately offers himself up as bait. He may well die when Viserys sends him a letter saying, I'm gonna help you, I'm gonna send troops down to help with the war in the Stepstones. He's like, I would rather die than accept help. Like, it's because, obviously, if the king sends help, he sends troops, and then they win, it's the king's victory. And Daemon needs this to be his victory. He needs it to be his achievement. This need for approval and independence to these incredibly self-destructive ends is a really interesting thing to explore with Daemon's character. And interestingly, that moment where he receives the letter and then like beats the guy half to death, he shoots the messenger basically, it is taken from another moment in this book. Although I couldn't find it, but I swear I read it, where Daemon basically hits the messenger because he was so frustrated with the news. My question is this: why is Daemon so likable? Like, he has done some of the worst, cruelest things we've seen in the series so far, but somehow you can't help but root for him? I don't really get it. Why do I feel like this? Why do I like him? I don't know. Matt Smith is totally selling me, and I love the scene where he goes to offer himself up. Okay, I will admit, I'm not 100% certain what their plan was with the battle at the end of the episode. Okay, so The crab feeder, whenever the dragons show up, would just flee with his army into all these caves across the island. They would just not fight. This is something the Dornish actually did when Aegon showed up originally for the conquest. They never gave battle. But they say, hey, we've got to get them out of these caves. We've got to fight them. And their plan was send one guy as bait, and the crab feeder's entire army will come out to fight, and then you attack them? I don't quite get how all of that works. Like, why would he send his entire army out? Or was it just enough of the army, and did Corlys's men show up secretly on the beach? I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I'm not really one to fuss over that too much. It looked cool, it was fun. It didn't really break my immersion. There was this fantastic moment when Laenor just comes down and burns a ring of Triarchy soldiers. That is one thing, by the way, they have done so much better than Game of Thrones. The dragon fire, it has so much weight and force to it now. I swear we're seeing people get like instantly incinerated, which is great. I will admit though, Laenor's actor, he's had a few lines in this episode and they were really flat. Not super sure. I don't know. I hope he gets more screen time so we can see his acting chops. But still, I really enjoyed this episode. I think it's got a lot of depth. It's got one of my favorite scenes. It's really good. What did you guys think? Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future.